Everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us. I'm Professor Karen Thompson, the Director of the Consortium for Gender, Sexuality, Race, and Public Culture, which is affiliated with the Department of Gender and Sexuality Studies here at USC. One of the things that the consortium does is to create occasions where research can be shared in public dialogue and conversation. And I'm very excited to be hosting Professor Ameeth Vijay here today to talk about work from his most recent book, as well as to have a more general conversation with Professor Neetu Khanna. I'm going to be introducing our speakers today. First of all, Professor Ameeth Vijay from the University of California, San Diego in the Department of Literature. Professor Vijay specializes in global Anglophone literature, modern and contemporary British literature, post-colonial studies, and urban studies. And he's the author of a truly wonderful book, Topthesia, Planning Colonialism and Places in Excess from Fordham University Press, published in 2023. This book, as you'll be learning a little bit about today, examines the intersections between literature, urban planning, and architecture, and tracks the persistence of colonial relationships in the development of contemporary spaces. And one of the things that I most also appreciate about Professor Vijay's work is that it engages the important sort of reasons for why we need to be, but there's also an echo, but can we work on this a little bit? Why we need to be aware of and cognizant of what urban development does and means, because sometimes we get caught up in the kind of excitement of these things. And honestly, Professor Vijay's work on the Olympics, for example, and what some of the kind of issues and concerns are with the planning that's created around such things as Olympic Games is you'll see the seeds of that work in this book as well. I'm also going to introduce Professor Neetu Khanna, who will be in conversation with Professor Vijay today. Professor Khanna's areas of interest include theories and literatures of decolonization, global Marxism, post-colonial literature and theory, materialist aesthetics, and queer and feminist theory. She is currently the director of the Center for Feminist Research here at USC, and her recent book, The Visceral Logics of Decolonization, rethinks the global project of decolonization by exploring a set of relations between embodied experience and political feeling. In any case, we're so delighted to be able to have these two wonderful scholars in conversation today. So without further ado, let me let Professor Vijay begin his talk. Please welcome him. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, how's everyone doing today? So I just wanted to thank Karen, Neetu, Sam, and everyone here at USC for making this possible. I know it was rescheduled. Just thanks for making this possible. So I wanted to be talking to you today about my book, Topthesia, Planning Colonialism and Places in Excess. How I wanted to begin is by relating an anecdote about how I got started with this book and why I became interested in this topic. And it has to do with a very specific historical anecdote related to the 1981 urban riots in Liverpool, London, and other locations in Britain. So these events were, of course, sparked by incidents of police brutality, surveillance. They spoke to dissatisfaction with dismal prospects for employment and housing, especially for Black working class youth. In their aftermath, Liverpool was visited by Margaret Thatcher's Secretary of State for the Environment, Michael Heseltine, that's him, next to Thatcher, who was sent to formulate a plan on how to address these riots. So 1 year later, Barry Newman summed up this scheme that Heseltine eventually proposed in the Wall Street Journal. So he writes, quote, "The centerpiece is a plan to spruce up 865 acres of decrepit dockland for a huge international garden festival. Millions will flock to Liverpool to look at flowers. It is hoped that Liverpool will get a job center, a training center, 6 small factory units, and trees." Or as the anthropologist Jacqueline Nassy Brown writes, quote, "The most absurd outcome of the riots was that the British government, after carefully studying the root causes, decided that what Black people really needed was a more uplifting environment." So as absurd as this was, I became interested in asking, what are the conditions of possibility that allowed for the planting of trees and gardens to be offered as solutions to these really complex social and political problems that had developed in post-war Britain? For what Heseltine took for granted was a direct association between the problems of social alienation and community conflict on the one hand, and something called the environment on the other. That is, he thought that by restoring the supposedly ruined, derelict environment, perhaps by planting trees, one could also restore and regenerate individuals who were also seen as ruined and derelict. Groundwork UK, a charity enlisted by Heseltine to help with this regeneration, succinctly expressed the ethos, quote, changing places, changing lives. So the riots, especially the images of them disseminated in news media, seemed, and really still seem, to bring together and concretize an array of issues and themes: class inequality, race and racism, police and the rhetoric of law and order, urban decay, the post-industrial city, among others. However, responses to these images entangle political ideologies and structures of feelings in ways that resonate far beyond the events themselves. So my book traces the genealogy of ideas, ideologies, and imaginaries that made this response possible, and tracks the constellated practices and aesthetics of planning to the contemporary moment. So Topthesia, what this term means, it's a rhetorical device referring to the vivid depiction of an often imaginary place. So oftentimes used to sort of characterize the work of Thomas More or other utopian authors. So my book uses the term to theorize urban planning as a mode of speculative fiction, one that even in its most mundane documents is compelled to produce elaborate fantasies of future places. So as Topthesia, the imaginaries of planning and contemporary development are tightly linked to histories and practices of liberal colonialism, and I connect the archive of planning theory in the late British Empire, so from the late 19th century, to contemporary practices of urban development, in order to understand more generally the form and stakes of their speculative worlds. Beginning with the influential Garden Cities movement, early planning unsurprisingly inscribed the cultural prerogatives of the late empire into its presumptions of what place was and what it could do. Though planning grew into a further humanistic and technocratic practice, Topthesia argues that these early inscriptions, assumptions, and imaginaries continue to shape contemporary development. So the beginnings of planning, of professional planning in the late 19th century operated according to the logic of liberal colonialism that I define specifically as those endeavors that seek to improve and develop places. So throughout Topthesia, I consider the ways this imaginary was presented as reconciliatory of political conflict and disagreement. So whether in regards to working class agitation in the late 19th century, or revolutionary uprisings in the British Raj, or the contemporary politics of space, housing, and development, the creation of new planned spaces continually promised to displace conflict and integrate dissatisfied subjects. So I'll kind of skip over some of the details from earlier on in the book, and I can kind of come back to these, but these are some examples of this kind of colonial archive. One is related to Australia, and the other two related to plans for in Palestine, Tel Aviv, and Jerusalem. I can come back to that in the Q&A if that's of interest. So the main contributions of this project are to show how the idioms of planning and development connect liberal and colonial practices, and how those practices continue to resonate in the contemporary neoliberal moment in our gentrified cities. In fact, I argue that that resonance is only understandable in the context of still active colonial epistemologies. And in this way, insist on reading the discourses of planning, design, architecture, infrastructure through a post-colonial lens. Similarly, I focus on the speculative aesthetics and cultures of planning as constitutive of, and not simply adjunct to, the operation of their political economies. Along these lines, I read urban planning discourse as a form of literature. Topthesia is not just a historical account of the gap between a vivid fiction of an imaginary place and its reality, but rather reads this gap as a literary index of planning's governing multiple contradictory epistemologies. To this end, I take note of the form of urban planning discourse. For example, early 20th century planners used diagrammatic models, richly detailed practical theoretical texts, and pedagogic lectures and conversations to impress the importance of town and country planning to their fellow middle-class elites, both in Britain and the wider empire. These were modes of speculative fiction, ways of imagining a particular future while foreclosing other futures. This becomes a more general feature of the development plan, which Hannah Appel notes is, quote, both speculative in itself and relying on the speculation of others, aimed to seduce speculative capital. I therefore read the proliferation of contemporary planning theory, documents, advertising, and perspectives as themselves concretizations of a political futurity, even when avowedly apolitical. That is, ways of understanding what places should be, for whom they should be, and what they should look like. Planning as literature, therefore, de-emphasizes narrative control, including assumptions of top-down intentionality, while remaining attentive to what is its speculative ideas foreclosed in their pursuit of a particular future. So in these moments, the putatively dry, technical discourse of planning becomes excessive in its florid attention to detail, evoking a futurity that is sensuous and tangible, promising utopia that is not distant but just over the horizon. All right, so to kind of return to the main theme here, having established some of the sort of outline and contributions of the project as a whole, I want to return to the scene of Liverpool in 1981 and Britain in general in the 1980s. The continuities from the 19th century to the present are multiple. Liberal colonialism and its ethos of improvement and cultivation, the deflection and resolution of social conflict through development, the temporalities and aesthetics of the speculative, the slum as a problem and the garden as a solution. Like the figure of the slum for early 20th century planners, the events of these riots concatenated the contradictions and tensions of post-colonial neoliberal Britain. So Heseltine's verdant solution to the problems thrown up by the riots sits in interesting relation to the political dynamics of these events that seem to conform to a well-worn template. I should note here that there is a problem in how to name these events. Are they riots, rebellions, protests, disturbances? Typically, those distinctions have to do with the way these events are read and made legible along a standard political spectrum. However, I employ the term riots here to insist on the opacity of these events, instead of focusing on their ultimate cause. I seek to understand how a response to them index a range of ideological and epistemological assumptions that become embedded, in fact, in the built environment. So I can talk about this more in the Q&A as well. So, however understood, the riots of the 80s have served as a cultural mnemonic for the Thatcherite period. And you'll see this even today in Britain when the Thatcher period is brought up. There are a few sort of set of images, and sort of urban riots are one of these set of images that come up. Thatcher herself, almost instinctually, turned to individual pathology to explain the riots. She would later write about the Toxteth neighbor of Liverpool. Quote, I observed for all that was said about deprivation, the housing there was by no means the worst in the city. I have been told that some of young people involved got into the trouble through boredom and not having enough to do. But you only have to look at the grounds around those houses with the grass untended, some of it almost waist high, and the litter, to see that this was a false analysis. They had plenty of constructive things to do if they wanted. Instead, I asked myself how people could live in such circumstances without trying to clear up the mess and improve their surroundings. What was clearly lacking was a sense of pride and personal responsibility, something which the state can easily remove but never give back. So Thatcher here is reluctant to consider issues of police brutality or systematic deprivation for the riots. Indeed, she instead rejects the very premise of deprivation. Thatcher's eye in this passage is drawn to the condition of the housing. For her, the overwhelming mess of the waist-high grass and litter serve as metonyms for individuals who lack personal responsibility and pride. As Simon Parker and Roland Atkinson write, eschewing a sociological or structural reading of the sources of discontent, discrimination, and a setting of profound urban decline, her view inclined towards the Treasury view that the Merseyside, that's Liverpool's economy, could not have ever been rescued through a further pouring in of more resources to no purpose. So indeed, Thatcher's response resonated with many conservatives during the period. Interestingly, though, it's not the descriptive of the actual state response to the riots in the area of urban policy in Thatcher's government. Instead, conservatives were ultimately won over by the views of Heseltine. So his report on the riots based on his visits to Liverpool were entitled, It Took a Riot, and these were only fully declassified in 2011, and they reflect the influence of American-style public-private partnerships. Where a conservative like Thatcher defaulted to individual pathology, Heseltine, also a conservative, saw the riots as a symptom with structural causes with a solution based in state intervention. His solutions, broadly, are for the state to lead a revival of urban neighborhoods and economies by creating incentives for private investment. These solutions are by now familiar. The state leads reclamation of derelict brownfield sites, and then creates enterprise zones to lure investment and create spaces for consumption and recreation, that is state-led gentrification. Heseltine would later note that, quote, today such policies by and large command all party support, but it was a conservative government over the next few years that forced through the necessary changes. This division is important to mark because it also speaks to how Heseltine's program of state-led urban regeneration is what was new to neoliberalism compared to Thatcher's reactionary Victorianism. Indeed, the former is what ended up capturing the establishment left in the UK, resulting in a very similar policy platforms of New Labour. I'll say just a note about these documents. They're interesting. The version that's available in the National Archives has these kind of annotations. So some minister or someone, took this report and underlined certain words, and all of the words have to do with like parents, unemployed parents who are single, this kind of stuff. So you can kind of get a sense of who Heseltine's audience was and what they were thinking of as they were reading these things. So Heseltine's thoughts, meanwhile, in urban regeneration are framed by nostalgia for once great cities and a sense that these spaces had become ruined and lost to history. So in his autobiography, he creates the following scene of himself in 1981. He writes, "Alone every night, when the meetings were over and the pressure was off, I would stand with a glass of wine, looking over the magnificent view over the river and ask myself, what had gone wrong for this great English city? The Mersey, its lifeblood, flowed as majestically as ever down from the hills. Its monumental Georgian and Victorian buildings, created with such pride and by such cost to the city's fathers of a century or more earlier, still dominated the skyline. The liver building itself, the epicenter of a trading system that had reached out to the four corners of the earth, stood defiant and, from my perspective, very alone. The port had serviced an empire and sourced a world trade. In truth, everything had gone wrong. Topthesia, a tiny microcosm in terms of location and population, became a very misleading symbol, though so a symptom of a spreading disease." The tone of this passage is melancholic and contemplative. The reader is given an image of a protagonist of urban regeneration surveying the city, itself beset by both an apathetic decay and violence. The loneliness of this image is paralleled in the city environment itself, both in the majestic river that connects Britain to the sea and in the monumental and defiant Royal Liver building. Liverpool's now derelict docks used to connect the country to the, quote, seven seas, a metonym not only for the city's industrial history, but also for Britain's colonial and settler colonial projects, including transatlantic slavery. In contrast, the current state of the city, Topthesia included, is likened to a symptom of a contagious disease. In all these ways, it continues the history of planning from the 19th century, which took it as its object the slum, and proposed as its solution the imaginary of a new place, along with new people. Therefore, so-called property-led regeneration was not only about tax benefits and below rate of sale of state office buildings, it was and is, in a fundamental way, an aesthetic and moral enterprise. This approach culminated for Heseltine in the creation of that garden festival, planting some 2,500,000 trees. He explained the concept, quote, use public money to eliminate dereliction, and green the area to produce a high-quality environment, stage a festival of attractions for 6 months, and then sell the much-improved site for redevelopment. We organized a national competition offering public money for the reclamation of significant derelict sites. So the garden here serves as a figure for the renewal and regeneration. Aesthetically, it stands in contrast to the imposing and crumbling tower blocks and to the riotous spectacle of burning buildings. And you can almost see the neighborhood kind of in the background while the garden kind of stands in the foreground in this picture. As such, it does the cultural and ideological work of imagining a green, healthy, vibrant future at odds with a ruined present. Having transformed a, quote, unsightly derelict area, the image of the garden does the work of drawing capital to the city. Thus, the neighborhood of riots, dangerous, derelict, without recreation, is juxtaposed to the city as a magnet for investment. Here, the aesthetics of the city, rather than its politics, are what determines its capacity for revival. So, while Heseltine focused on the aesthetics of the built environment as a site of generalized moral and economic improvement, other actors sought to use the environment as a tool for social control. So here I'd like to argue that urban planning embeds speculative policing into its designs. Specifically, Britain sees the developments that parallel the US intervention of order maintenance policing, more properly known as broken windows policing. Coined by James Q. Wilson and George L. Kelling, and popularized by New York Police Commissioner William Bratton, this theory held that policing forms of minor disorder like litter, graffiti, panhandling, group loitering could work to establish social norms and reduce more serious crimes. So disorder for the broken windows theory consists in visual environmental cues, all of those things that for some planners and developers are indicative of the slum, the inner city, or the derelict neighborhood. For order maintenance policing, these cues are signs that it can both be read hermeneutically to uncover a deeper social decay, but also produce social meaning and the norms in urban environments. As such, removing the signs of disorder through policing can have the effect of ameliorating social decay and reducing the incidence of violent crime. So though broken windows has a US-centric history, there are parallel developments in the UK for using the environment to police and manage social control, particularly through the institution of what's called antisocial behavior initiatives. Stuart Hall and the authors of Policing the Crisis, for example, noted how anti-mugging squads engaged in a kind of, quote, anticipatory policing that by increasing surveillance and interactions between police and civilians play a role in increasing the overall crime rate and extending the purview and, should say decreasing, and extending the purview and impact of legal institutions on everyday life. In fact, one of the more blatant examples of anticipatory policing was something called Operation Swamp 81. This was in the Brixton area of London, right before the 1981 riots in Brixton. This was named in astonishing honesty after the infamous anti-immigrant remarks of Margaret Thatcher, who said that immigrants were swamping the country. This operation saw an increase of police in Brixton. Swamp 81 and the policing of black communities more generally made use of the provisions of the 1824 Vagrancy Act, which made suspicious behavior, which they shortened by the law as the designation sus, a, quote, arrestable offense without any other crime having to be committed, any witnesses other than 2 police officers, or even a victim. So the extensive use of police stops, disproportionately targeting black youth as sus, exacerbated tensions with police in the weeks before the riots. So practices of police surveillance and neoliberal idiom of improvement came together in the work of Alice Coleman, particularly in her study on modernist housing estates called Utopia on Trial, 1985. A geographer and later housing advisor to Thatcher, Coleman criticized council housing as a, quote, scene of many kinds of social malaise. Utopia on Trial shares several features with anticipatory order maintenance policing. Coleman is centrally concerned with violent crime, and yet instead of studying crime directly, she turns to surface-level environmental cues, writing that, quote, as we could not afford to lie and wait for incidents to happen, we chose types of malaise that leave behind visible traces: litter, graffiti, vandal damage, and excrement. These visible traces serve as evidence of a deeper and more first social decay, and are also assumed to reproduce the conditions for that decay. Citing Oscar Newman, she criticizes design that does not allow for, quote, defensible space, or the ability not only for police, but for the community to surveil itself at all moments. So this is her book, Utopia on Trial. And indeed, this preoccupation with criminality is present even in the form of the book here, with the titular analogy of the trial carried throughout each of the book's chapters. Similar to how broken windows advocates render victimless crimes into acts of serious harms to the community and social order, Coleman seeks to render the built environment into a criminal master plan. Personifying the design elements of modernist estates as, quote, suspects lined up for identification, she asks, quote, what are their descriptions? Are they of good character? Do they keep bad company? Do they have alibis? Are they ringleaders or accomplices or innocent parties? So we even see here as she's analyzing sort of design elements of these housing estates, these kind of public housing areas, she's calling them the suspects, case for prosecution, cross-examination. So she structures her whole, book around the idea that the housing estate is a potential criminal itself. So despite collecting statistics for litter, graffiti, etc. on several London housing estates, Utopia on Trial is written in many places in a speculative style. Coleman jumps from observations of design features, for example, common greens or first floor garages, and invents whole cloth stories about how they invariably lead to crime or social deterioration. Such speculative thinking attends to every ostensible empirical metric of malaise. For example, signs of urine are attributed wholesale to alcoholics in the community, tolerance of whom attracts not only more alcoholics, but also methamphetamine users. Or litter as a categorization extends from, quote, any chance piece of rubbish to, quote, concealed murdered bodies, as if per inevitable progression from one to the other. Like advocates of order maintenance policing, she argues that design elements either incentivize or discourage criminal activity, with the caveat that some subset of the population has a propensity for crime. Here she writes, quote, there are a few who will always rise above adversity, no matter how appalling the environment, while at the other end, there are a few who will always be sluts or criminals, even in ideal conditions. So designing for surveillance and social norms minimizes the deleterious effects, both racialized and gendered here, of the latter. Similarly, she not only dismisses the role unemployment and poverty might play in social malaise, but speculates that design of housing estates might produce individuals less interested in employment. She writes, we can envisage a chain reaction in which badly designed blocks of flats make children less easy to bring up and more likely to become antisocial and uncontrollable. When they go to school, they may well resist educative control and be unwilling to learn, giving the school a reputation of a blackboard jungle. Despite the constant rhetoric of basing design in empirical study, this imagined chain reaction is purely speculative and topothesic in the way that it evokes the scene of childhood within the confines of the badly designed block of the home and the racialized blackboard jungle of the school. Coleman contrasts the space with the familiar figure of the garden in the single-family home, a space where children can learn to, quote, learn to care for the home territory, partly through the natural impulse to imitate parents, and partly while being taught, until litter abstention and litter clearance become ingrained habits. So whereas the common green of the council estate has a confused sense of ownership and thus encourages antisocial activity, the space of the private garden is one of liminal experimentation for the child. The garden is presented in the text as a scene of cultivation, not only of the plants, but of the children. Thus, we see a through line between the humanistic and optimistic colonial garden city planners and Coleman, the urban geographer of the neoliberal project. Against the ostensible periodizations of the 20th century and against surface-level political divisions of the post-war period, we see deep epistemological continuities. So just to conclude here, in Shades of Black, Stuart Hall writes that, quote, Thatcherism and free market neoliberalism were the forces that successfully hegemonized crisis in the post-war settlement. The above analysis of Heseltine's use of property-led regeneration and Coleman's order maintenance architectural critique indicates some of the ways in which the crisis, concretized through a series of images of what Hall calls the racial upheavals of 1980 to 81 and 1985, gave way to a consensus on how urban space and its layered sociality should be visibly ordered. So in this context, Heseltine's fascination with tree planting as a solution to the riots and to the space of the inner city as an attempt at grounding in excess, giving it tangibility and particularity, constraining its past and futures. The gesture is as absurd on its face as it is foundational for the interventions of 20th century planning, and before that, the colonial logics of cultivation. So I can talk more about this in the Q&A, but just to kind of summarize here, I turn in this chapter to talking about order maintenance policing and the kind of built environment as anticipatory policing, to looking at how Black artists kind of responded to this rhetoric in the 1980s. Specifically looking at John Akomfra's film Handsworth Songs, which was from 1985, which is an experimental documentary about the 1985 riots in Birmingham, but also kind of foregrounds the role that spectacle and visuality play in representing the riots, but also representing Blackness and people of color in general in post-war Britain. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much for that. That was wonderful, and it's very exciting to have you here because I've had the pleasure of reading various versions of this project and being in conversation with you through its development. So, and then every time I return to the text, return to this book, I'm still in conversation with you. So it's really nice to kind of materialize this here. I have a lot of my students here today who are in my comparative literature class, and we've and the whole class actually centers on London. We've just read Mrs. Dalloway, and then we're going to turn to kind of Black Britain. So all of this is going to be really important for my students. So I have some comments that are that fold into questions. But one of the things that I find so important about this book and about your work, and so compelling, is that kind of city planning and development, this idea that's so in our kind of everyday parlance, becomes this very rich prism through which to kind of look at this very important relationship for post-colonial scholars and for any study of imperialism, which is the relationship between the colonial metropole and the colony, right? So for my students, what I'm talking about is the relationship between the center of empire, London, and then the colonies. So you can think about the world of Mrs. Dalloway and then the world of Peter Walsh, right? And that the kind of cross traffic between those two things is so important for our study, and I feel like your book has something very important to say about this. And I'm thinking about all the ways that you demonstrate the importance of understanding the colony as a kind of laboratory for all kinds of forms of governmentality and sociality and extraction that are implemented in kind of colonies, and then kind of implemented into the colonial metropole and vice versa. Everything from urban policing that you're talking about to also I'm also thinking about anti-colonial authors who always saw the colony as a laboratory for European fascism, which we're seeing the kind of roots of today. So, but I love how you're sort of tracing ideas about planning and the cultivation of modern subjects and moral subjects through like actual city planners and actual kind of documents who are moving between England, Palestine, India, Australia. I mean, that is a really incredible dimension of your project. So I think that's a really important contribution of it, and very much relatedly, I love the way that you're drawing a variety of links and continuities between colonialism and gentrification. It's really one of the most important parts of the book for me, and I think you have the unique ability to do this in this project. Because of the way you're moving between urban planning and literary studies. So reading planning documents as speculative fiction and reading fiction that's not properly speculative through the trace of the speculative that comes through urban planning imaginaries. I love your chapters on gentrification, especially the way you tease out temporalities of gentrification and how they confound our understandings of colonial temporalities of progress and development through tropes of the pop-up, precarity, temporariness, lastness, as you call it. And I just really love all the ways that you're reading the aesthetic and the culture of gentrification, gentrified neighborhoods, which is just so like immediately recognizable to us now. The idea of design being this conduit for the kind of capacity to fully realize the self. I mean, all of this is just so brilliant. So one of the things I just wanted to ask you to do just to start us off is if you could talk a little bit about how you conceive of the relationship between colonialism and gentrification. I'll tell you a little bit about why this has been a kind of knotted problem for me, but and I actually think that in various chapters you conjoin these ideas differently, but I'd just love to hear you sort of just open up and talk to us about like how you think about those two things in your project, or more generally.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for your comments throughout really the whole process of drafting this book. But yeah, so I kind of start with the late 19th century. That's when planning really starts to become something that takes on a kind of professional quality to it. That's when you start to get positions in universities for people who are talking about planning, and particularly the Garden Cities movement. Which called itself the person Ebenezer Howard, who started the Garden Cities movement in the late 19th century, called it a practice of home colonization. Right? And I was just kind of struck by that and thinking about the colony, not just as maybe how we might think about it as like kind of the explicit metropole and the explicit space of the colony, but as a relationship in space, and as a set of practices, right? And so the home colony, and this was part of a whole discourse in the late 19th century around workers' colonies, around what to do with this kind of excessive working class, or as they would call it, the quote unquote undeserving poor. This is a distinction in Britain. and this kind of impoverished what they saw, the middle classes saw in London as a kind of excess to the city. There was a lot of anxiety about this excess that was had to do with the way that they were placed in relationship to majoritarian British society, and particularly when in terms of mediating social conflict, when there started to be socialist uprisings and protests in these areas, this idea of colonization really took hold. And that was developed both influenced by, as you saw some of my early slides, influenced by work that had already been proposed for Australia, for other settler colonies, and in turn influenced how planners were able to then go out into the wider empire and realize some of their plans that maybe they weren't able to do at scale in Britain. And so there was always that kind of back and forth, but I think the key thing there was thinking about the relationship between, the spatial relationships between places as being colonial, not necessarily thinking of just this kind of explicit geographic relationship between London, let's say, and South Asia as being the only colonial relationship. And so that kind of allowed me to connect it to, that and other things allowed me to connect it to more of a present day focus, to think about, oftentimes we think about gentrification as colonial in one way or another,
right.
But to think about the specific epistemologies that lasted over that period of time in terms of how space was regarded relationally. And so I saw something very similar when I visited London in 2011 when the Olympics were, the construction for the Olympics were underway. It had to do with this this sort of gentrification of the East End in London, the same neighborhoods that had been sort of the problem areas for the late Victorian period. So I saw all these connections between very similar spaces and different practices between the colonial period and sort of modern, practices of development.
Yeah, that's great. And I was wondering if you actually, when you were sort of conceiving of this project and working with these documents, had you seen a kind of model for thinking across kind of colony metropole in this way, or did you kind of have to invent it?
A little bit. Well, I mean, there were definitely scholars who were kind of thinking about the kind of construction of place and how the construction of place could be, could kind of by itself be, I guess, out of time or out of geography in different ways, right? So thinking of the 19th century British Raj, British India, and the way the kind of architectural debates in British India between does Britain just import Gothic architecture and put it in India, or do they come up with this new style, this kind of Britanized version of what they think Indian architecture is like, right? So those debates were happening in the 19th century, and so I was kind of building on those a little bit to kind of think about how urban planning and the kind of design of space in cities more generally, not just in terms of buildings, but in terms of cities, maybe also followed some of those logics.
Okay, yeah, that's great. Yeah, because I was thinking, it was every time, in my classes I teach anti-colonial writers, the most famous being kind of Wretched of the Earth, Frantz Fanon, and that kind of phenomenological scene of the settler town and the native town, right? That kind of abject, cramped settler town, up against the sprawling, spacious, luxurious settler town, or against the native town, right? There's always a group of students who say, that's like downtown LA, right? Or that's like LA, and so, and immediately drawing those connections between gentrification in our contemporary moment and colonization, in this moment. And it's on one hand, I really want to nurture those connections, and on the other, really trying to, navigate the kind of questions of specificity around modalities of power and extraction. And so it's always been a puzzle for me. And so for me, I really love that your book kind of how nuanced and carefully it works through those things.
Yeah, I think something that the Garden City movement feeds back into the suburbanization and the kind of aesthetics of suburbanization in the United States, and to the way that, not necessarily downtown LA, but the way that Los Angeles, the kind of construction of Los Angeles, especially in the post-war period, was informed by this kind of consensus about what places should look like, and what they should be like.
Right.
And so you see these resonances, I guess I would call them, not necessarily the same thing, but kind of resonant with each other.
Yeah, great, thanks. So I actually wanted to move also to a little bit about methodology. I think you and I, it's very exciting to talk to someone who's the exact same training as me in many ways, post-colonial studies, Black British cultural studies were kind of both emerge from the same historical fold, like the cybernetic fold, but it's like the post-colonial fold.
Yeah.
And so I was really interested in the place that actually queer theory plays
Yes,
in much of the theorizing.
Yeah.
In this very post-colonial project, I think queer temporality seems very important, especially in the framing, drawing on Kara Keeling and Jose Munoz, but also cruel optimism. And I was telling you this, I really love the chapter on Zadie Smith's NW, and we end with NW in our class. And cruel optimism, we're also going to be reading cruel optimism. And it really made me think about this thing that happens every year whenever I teach this class, actually. So I started integrating cruel optimism when I was teaching Mrs. Dalloway. I thought it was like a great fit for thinking about cruel optimistic attachments to marriage, bourgeois marriage, and gender construction, and so on. And then I teach Lonely Londoners, which, as you know, is a kind of Windrush era West Indian novel about kind of first wave of post-colonial migration in London, and about the kind of racism and xenophobia that the characters are met with. And all my students want to write about cruel optimism and Lonely Londoners because of the way in which it opens up this very complex affective terrain of Black British Anglophilia, right? And this like attachment to the homeland, the inability to return home, And so it's just very interesting to me. And then I've seen a variety. I recently wrote about this in a special issue on affect theory and post-colonial studies, but like how much Lauren Berlant's cruel optimism spoke to post-colonial scholars because of its capacity to think through that very rich affective terrain and also kind of controversial affective terrain. So I was just wondering, I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about the role of queer theory and the role that it plays in your thinking in this project.
I'm just thinking, you're talking about Lonely Londoners. There's that one scene that one line where one of the characters talks about Charing Cross.
Yes.
And about how when he goes to Charing Cross and he maybe meets a girl there, he feels really important. It's like he feels like he's at the center of civilization. Yeah. Even while they're having all of these struggles kind of adapting and surviving in post-war Britain, right? And so there's that sense of like attachment that's like to a place where a place becomes something beyond itself, right? And that's a very familiar post-colonial dynamic. I think, but more generally, in terms of queer theory, I think someone like Munoz really helped me think through what I was doing with the speculative, in particular, and that kind of temporality, because so one of the odd things maybe about the book is that I talk about planning as a kind of speculative fiction. Yeah. But I think the maybe natural thing to do would be then to read a lot of speculative fiction alongside of that. Right. But I don't actually do that. Because for me, what I do take from queer theory is a kind of theorization of like what the speculative is. Yeah. Kind of stemming, from the Frankfurt School as well, from Ernst Bloch. One second. But I think, maybe my gloss is more pessimistic. So what I do with the literature that I read is kind of look at the way that planning maybe opened up certain speculative horizons, but it also foreclosed others, it closed other ones down. And so people as their characters, as they're negotiating or engaging with these spaces, are engaging both with the spaces that have been opened up for them, but also with that sense of something closing down and something being foreclosed. And especially getting to something like Zadie Smith and thinking about London in the early post-financial crash London, and the way in which there was this kind of post-colonial attachment to a certain idea of Black British identity, really Black British in that case middle class identity, that was both achieved but also that achievement being really hollow at the same time. So I think queer theory in general just helps me think through different ways of thinking about temporality and different ways of thinking about the speculative, and how, and where I take it from there is thinking about not just what the speculative opens up and the kind of alternate possibilities that it opens up, but also about what it closes down sometimes. Yeah, okay, and that's exactly what I actually wanted to ask you about next. That the main kind of thrust of the book, as I understand it, is to use the speculative to kind of read urban planning documents
the vivid detail of this imaginary invoked in the title, the desires and fantasies bound up in planning, but combined with this concrete realizability of these planned places. And this ends up, I think, one of the things I really like about the book is it ends up putting a very interesting set of pressures on the speculative, which is very much a very celebrated genre right now. I think like in my department, probably all of us are overseeing at least 1 or 2 dissertations on speculative fiction. So it's a very interesting, it very much enters in a very interesting conversation with speculative fiction. But where these temporalities that you're talking about of the speculative kind of leads you are these horizons of ambivalence, right? As you're saying, they open up as much as they close down down as much as they open up. And I just wanted to hear a little bit about how you, how we're to understand this kind of horizon of ambivalence, maybe in thinking about post-colonial politics or post-colonial scholarship, because I think it's very interesting in relationship to, and this is something I've been tracking as I've been teaching post-colonial theory classes, particularly in my graduate seminars, is that kind of, the post-colonial studies of like late 90s and early 2000s, like always searching for horizons of possibility, right? Always the horizon of possibility, these sites of resistance, the kind of continual unfolding of the possibility that's just below the surface. If we can just, harness the aesthetic energy and the political energy, And I still very much believe in those things because I'm trained to, but it just does feel so strangely optimistic looking back from the current position that we're in. And so to me, your argument kind of captures that or symptomatic of that in some interesting ways, but I'd just love to hear you talk about that.
I think it's part maybe just my sensibility of things, but it's, there was this, I think, trend in post-colonial studies, as you say, in the 90s and 2000s, where every argument kind of had to end on a kind of note of positivity. Especially when it came to the role of like literature or media, film, that was supposed to resolve like whatever political problem or tension or historical trauma had been introduced, And I think that, first of all, the material that I'm working with, especially, for example, someone like Zadie Smith, but also the kind of practices of gentrification that are ongoing, I didn't necessarily see tangibly and materially that the aesthetics of development could be like meaningfully counteracted. I mean, they were being counteracted, but at the same time, they were leading to transformations of cities, in many different places, and of spaces. And so I think I was less invested in an academic project that would kind of neatly resolve the kind of political and historical problems that were being raised. In the sense that I didn't really think that, and maybe I'm skeptical of whether these kinds of intellectual projects by themselves are the means to solve those things, right? So I didn't want to kind of lead to a point where I would say, but there's this novel that can resolve these tensions. So this author does a good job of resolving these tensions, because I think that these are still kind of ongoing and active and extremely problematic discussions. I mean, one example of that, so right now I'm working a little bit on this development in Saudi Arabia called Neom. Has anyone heard of this? It's a development, they want to build an entire city in the form of a line. You might have seen something on this on social media or something. It's a really absurd development, but Saudi Arabia, which is clearing out indigenous population in the area, Saudi Arabia, which is also, kind of authoritarian regime, is working with all of these Western development companies, architects, who are lending their approval to these projects and kind of helping them design this really kind of environmentally insane idea to have a city in the form of a line. Now they want to connect this project with development in Gaza as well, right? And so, I think being situated in those politics, like it's hard to make the claim that a novel or a film is the end point to our thinking there. There has to be something more after that as well.
Yeah, it's really interesting. So something kind of similar happens in my own, like the book that I had written a few years ago, where I really, because of my training, I was focusing on kind of 1930s anti-colonial writing in South Asia, and I was really looking for their kind of articulations of various horizons of possibility and social transformation. But in kind of engaging the aesthetics of this text, it was like every moment of possibility is also written in with its kind of impending failure, or its kind of, easy turn, like its, its inevitable turn to a form of fascism or capitalism or neocolonialism. It was sort of, you couldn't kind of extricate either of those things. And I remember giving a talk about my book, and somebody saying that it's very interesting. It's not quite the, say, pessimism turn of Afro-pessimisms, but it's definitely a move away from the kind of almost like imperative of, optimism, or like finding the possibility of a certain moment of post-colonial studies that we're in. So I think there's something interesting about where the conversations are moving and what we feel, the kinds of arguments that we feel that we can make as post-colonial scholars.
Yeah, I wonder if it's even resonant with this kind of like post-colonial disillusionment, like the kind of post-independence letdown, of independent nation states, post-colonial nation states that kind of weren't what was promised in one way or another, and kind of there's something kind of similar there, and kind of dealing with the kind of bathos of that moment.
Yeah, it was like when I, recently, because I've been thinking a lot about this, because it's really marked in my graduate students' relationship to kind of earlier post-colonial texts, where they're like, what is this, or there's just like almost illegibility in the kind of argumentation that's being made there. And I went back to Paul Gilroy's Post-Colonial Melancholy, which is like written right after 9/11. And I was just so surprised by the, like the hopefulness of, you're right, like even then there's like this kind of hopeful attachment to melancholia to kind of invert the idea of the pathology, and really there's this possibility. And it's very, very striking in relationship to our current moment.
Well, something with like that text, I think there's a tendency to sort of almost adopt a kind of progressive stagist understanding of race and racial relations.
Right.
And kind of impose that. And in this moment, right, the 1980s is often thought of as, well, there was this nostalgia for empire, or the post-Brexit moment as being about nostalgia for empire, which really kind of, I think, it does the effect of kind of almost like offloading the kind of perceived, racism of those moments onto kind of a subset of like, let's say the white working class or something like that. Whereas when you look at the dynamics, they're actually much more complicated, right? So in one of my chapters, I'm thinking of the dynamics of race alongside class, and how those, and alongside provincial areas, and how those three dynamics kind of all work together to produce a kind of mutual disenfranchisement and mutual marginalization.
Yeah. Do I have time for one more question? Or should we open up to question? Okay. Open up to question?
If you want to wrap up with a question.
Maybe we'll open up to question, and if not, then I'll come back to this one. Yeah, questions.
Questions or comments?
I thank you for that. That was a very interesting talk. I wanted to ask about Northern Ireland because just in terms of what was going on contemporaneous to what Thatcher was doing in Liverpool, and I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about, so since your project touches on settler colonialism, how that relationship between what Thatcher's, the way the rhetoric was shaped around Liverpool and just those rights in England, and how they were kind of handling Belfast and Northern Ireland at the same time, and if that is some kind of urban planning or some kind of like urban non-planning, or what was going on in contrast or in comparison.
Well, I think the situation in a city like Belfast was, in some ways had this kind of high stakes character to it, right? That maybe informed the kind of military presence, right? That was there. At the same time, you have this sort of the use of police and this vagrancy law to pretty much establish these kind of mini or temporary police states in certain areas in Britain, right? Where you think about this vagrancy law, which they're using and they're bringing back to sort of say that anyone that is declared as suspicious for any reason, with only 2 officers looking at it for having done nothing, could be arrested, right? And so you see kind of similarities in that sort of policing style. The other thing I would say is that, and what I was kind of getting to with this material was that this is also the age of when CCTV becomes a very prominent feature of urban, of cities and of urban areas. And so you see malls or other kind of public spaces being securitized through CCTV, and in fact, this being kind of pushed through by the companies that were kind of administering these malls and so forth. So you see that in Liverpool or other spaces. And so this kind of combines, the surveillance of technology with the surveillance of sort of more widespread policing. And I would say in Northern Ireland, there was a military element there as well, obviously. So yeah, and Northern Ireland too, to go back to the 19th century, these same planners who would work in London would go to Dublin, then would go to, so not to Northern Ireland, but all of Ireland, go to Dublin, then go to Palestine. Like there was a circuit of planners, and really professional planning as a kind of, as a profession, really started through that imperial circuit. Patrick Getty is one of the planners that I look at. He's known for this phrase, think global, act local, right? This kind of phrase that was taken up by environmentalists, but the context of the global there was empire, was we can do this all over the world. So there was this kind of planning circuit that included Ireland, colonial Ireland, as well as other colonies in the 19th century as well.
Questions, comments?
I know you were talking about how like sometimes speculative fiction on its own isn't able to result too optimistic. Do you think that essentially the big request is like after futurist literature that won't substitute that in the context of your project? If it's like not enough on its own, what should be coupled with kind of encourage maybe a larger like possibility of change, or do you think it's more effective to turn into more like surrealist or like after-Wilson's methods?
Yeah, interesting. So, I mean, I don't want to make a blanket statement about speculative fiction because there's so many different kinds, and there's certainly dystopian fiction that's extremely valuable to us, Octavia Butler and so forth. But I would say that I think what the move that I was trying to not make was not so much about speculative fiction, but more about like the sort of academic tendency to want to kind of turn, especially in maybe literary studies, art, in the arts, to turn to literature or the arts or film as a kind of way out in that way, and kind of resolve the tensions and the problematics, historical problematics that were raised simply through this move of finding a kind of resolution in, say, a work of literature. And I think that not that there's not value there, but I think given the ongoing violence that's that's impacting, spaces, I want to say urban spaces, but really all kinds of different spaces, and the practices that are informing, the capitalist practices, the neo-colonial practices that are informing those changes, I think that it only signals a kind of a hesitancy or a dissatisfaction with intellectual life alone to navigate those changes, I guess. Yeah.
I think Pablo had.
Yes, hey, thank you. I'm not sure how to articulate it, but I was thinking about how you were talking about literature, this sort of function of both like denouncing a system, but at the same time consolidating it, sort of. And I think that's what, and this comes from my own pessimism as well, like that's what academia is as well. So my question to you two, from your pessimism or optimism, is to what extent do you think that informs your academic practice? And do you think that by sort of building these projects, you are like, what do you think is achievable different than what literature does in that sense in these academic projects and like in our practice?
Okay, so you're talking about my broader method and like what that adds to like literary studies, or are you thinking more about like our position within academia? The second one, yeah. I don't know. I mean, I think, I wrote a lot of this book from 2016 to like 2022. So, and I attended grad school in a post-financial collapse, world. So thinking about like my concrete position in academia, I think that there is, it's a set of problematic institutions in a lot of ways. And so that I try to always have my sort of academic work be at least in parallel to work to try to transform or change those institutions in whatever minor way, that I can. So I think that, the work itself and maybe the pessimism of the work is certainly informed by, the kind of more contemporary cultures of academia and its sort of neoliberalization. I mean, honestly, USC is a great example. In terms of the way a campus like USC or NYU interacts with the city space around it, and one can see that kind of colonial relationship in those interactions, right? So, and it was those kind of embedded policing, tactics. So, so that's sort of ever present even in our kind of daily experience of universities, yeah. And this goes back historically. One of the planners I looked at, his main sort of, I showed you a picture, was planning universities as kind of key sites to spark urban planning. One of those universities being Hebrew University in Jerusalem, right? And so this connects to the history of universities as well, yeah.
Karen had a question.
I mean, I think it's a little bit of a comment. I'm not sure if it's totally positive. I hate to do that first. And it's going back to your reference to Octavia Butler and in just sort of thinking quite obviously about Octavia Butler's invocation in the wake of the LA wildfires, seen as a prophetic voice, what have you, having done the research even back in the 80s and 90s to quote unquote predict what the outcomes would be if certain things weren't paid heed. And I think that people look to that as a site of, I don't know, sustenance and amazingness. But actually what strikes me is that she told us 30 years ago what would happen and nobody did a damn thing. Right? And that's kind of the bleak element of the speculative. Where it's sort of like, there's so much that speculative fantasy, especially that's built upon research and understanding where things are headed by looking at the kind of concrete material things that exist there. So many people place purchase in those worlds that they envision anew. But I think it's important to remember, so do we see parable of the sower and of the talents as guides for what to do next? Should we be learning how to make stuff with acorns and learning how to shoot guns and thinking about where we will migrate when we have to walk across the 5 freeway, to find a habitable place? So I guess, my question is, I guess that example presents to us a very kind of concrete occasion to be okay, well, what do we do next, right? And as educators, I guess, we can take different turns with that. And I think having taught parable of the sower, fairly recently, I mean, I have said, well, maybe you should learn how to make things with acorns and other things, and grow your own food, what have you. But do you see, in other words, there are ways that people are kind of taking up the speculative now as almost instruction manuals for survivability in the future. And is that one direction among many possibilities in a place that feels like it's without possibility?
I just feel like the scene of reading has changed so much, or has to change so much and has changed so much. And I feel like I've been trying to articulate a question that you articulated much better. But yeah, it's I mean, I think this was the obsession with post-colonial studies at that moment too. But it's what does the scene of reading look like in this moment?
Yeah, I was just going to say, that's where someone like Kara Keeling's work is helpful in thinking about, there's a way in which it's about sort of how to position oneself in relationship to a futurity, and what sort of futurities are available and what are not available, but also about, I think that there's a kind of maybe an Afro-pessimist, Afro-futurist, like almost like knife edge here somewhere, where it's like, where you're kind of looking towards a futurity that was always already closed down in one way or another. And it's about surviving that futurity, not even surviving the present, but knowing what's going to happen and surviving that futurity. And so positioning oneself in relationship to that futurity in a way that would enable survival in one way or another. That's, I mean, very abstract, very vague, but that's one
But
thing.
it's in translatable terms, it's like, almost like one day at a time maybe gets you to a future, which is also self-help. Thank you.
Oh, I don't even remember what I was gonna say, but just that, like, I think that, I mean, I can't help but walk around this campus. I was away last semester, and like the levels of anticipatory policing on this campus are beyond anything I ever expected, and it was already bad before last year. And so I think your talk just, makes me think about not just the way that, not just USC's kind of colonial relationship to the surrounding community, but also the sorts of policing that have also been inverted and turned inward onto the kind of community itself. I mean, I think in a way that you also describe happening in your work. That's a comment. I don't remember what I was gonna say earlier, but it's been a great conversation.
Other comments, questions? Davey.
First of all, thank you so much for this really, really generative talk. I want to be very careful about how I phrase this. But I'm wondering if the methodologies that you have assembled for this really exciting project, how they might either speak to or be in tension with the, in recent days, the absolutely abhorrent things that Donald Trump has said about his plans of kind of replanning the Gaza Strip.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, no, I think it's definitely, it's part of our contemporary, I mean, just the sort of the idea of, I mean, it's a very colonial idea of here's an entire area, yes, there are people there, but we can just replan it and we could put something else there. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if you've seen images of even, they've, not since then, but even from last year, mocked up images of what this would look like. And it's this kind of techno-futurist kind of boilerplate, development sort of aesthetic, right? I think sort of reading those aesthetics is important for thinking, that's exactly the kind of speculative fiction that I'm talking about, and reading those aesthetics and thinking about what sort of worlds they make possible at expense of what else, right? And I think that part of my project goes through, and I mentioned a little bit, but goes through the history of Palestine and the role that even garden city planning had, not just for planners, but also for settlers, who would translate garden cities of tomorrow into German, and use that to kind of think about their relationship to Palestine and their relationship to transforming the land. Very much anchoring a kind of settlement and the aesthetics of settlement against what was previously existing. So what was previously existing in Jaffa or other places was the slum, was this kind of chaotic, crowded, not optimal use of land situation. And what was planned instead was Tel Aviv, the kind of clean, modern, the white city, or what have you. And so that history is very much a settler colonial history, and very, very much one that I think it speaks to why it's important to kind of keep that longer history involved, because this isn't just Donald Trump. This is a longer history that has yes, it has its own material effects, and it also has, but it kind of produces those material effects in part through its aesthetics. Yeah.
To wrap up. Okay, I think we should wrap up. Thank you so much. That was really amazing and generative, and thank you so much for your comments and questions.